Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Thunder on the Moor by Andrea Matthews, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue, Scottish Border, 1513. Robert Armstrong dug his spurs deep into the sides of his chestnut pony. Twilight was coming on fast, and the thickening mist dampened his azure cap as he reached the crest of the moss-covered fell. It had been a hard ride, but victory was at last within his grasp. There below him, heading for the distant marsh grass, rode the mysterious Englishman who had been tracking his every move for nigh on to a fortnight. The hint of a smile crossed Robert's lips, and he turned sharply, making his way down the hill toward the tree line. The Englishman would soon realize he was no longer the hunter, but the quarry. Skirting a small copse of pine trees, Robert wound his way among the shadows, choosing his position wisely. He'd hunted men before, usually with his kinsmen, but today he rode alone. Until he knew the reason for the Englishman's sudden interest in him, he saw no need to involve his family. Of course, that didn't mean he intended on taking any foolish chances either. If the situation was about to come to a head, he wanted to hold the upper hand. Doing that would require all the stealth his father had taught him. Edward Foster made his way through the trees, casting a quick glance over his shoulder. He was supposed to be following the Scot, now the other way around. When did everything go so wrong? He cleared the pine grove and started down toward the river below, stopping for a moment to scan the hillside one more time. Where was the sneaky bugger? Disgusted with himself, he spurred his horse forward, but out of nowhere an arrow shot across his path. It lodged into a tree well clear of him, but split a branch overhead, causing his mount to spook and stumble. Edward scrambled from under his fallen steed, all too aware the Scot had turned the tables on him. He rose to his feet, swatting the dirt from his breeches and taking account of the immediate damage. No doubt his entire body would ache the next day, but other than ripping his left sleeve and somehow managing to dislodge one of his spurs, he appeared to be in one piece. Anxious to be on his way, he reached for his horse, relieved to see it too was none the worse for wear. The animal clearly thought otherwise, for Edward had no sooner taken hold of the reins than the creature bolted and took off in the opposite direction, knocking him from his feet in the process. "Son of a bloody nag!" Edward slid down the steep bank, searching in vain for something to grab onto, but instead lost his footing and tumbled headfirst into the thick, marshy grass along the burn. He jumped up, his dagger drawn, certain he was about to lose his head, but the Scot was nowhere in sight. Torn between relief and annoyance, he took a deep breath, wiping the mud from his face before making his way toward the shallow burn. Over the past few weeks, he'd come to know the rugged young man who only moments before had chased him down the heather-strewn knoll, and he felt sure Robert hadn't given up. He lurked out there somewhere, hidden in the rising haze, watching in silence, waiting to make his move. Edward's heart raced against his leather jack as he looked out across the windswept dale, searching the darkening horizon, but not even a wop flew from his nest. He had just sheathed his dagger when, without warning, something ticked his ear, and he spun around, plunging himself backwards into the cold water. How fragrant the ivory blossoms smelled, but the mud that clung to his clothes was not so sweet. Pulling himself back on solid ground, he cursed in frustration and swatted at the air around him. "Damn! I've lost him now for sure, stinking midges!" Cold and disheveled, Edward brushed himself off as best he could and climbed back up the slippery bank to a lee just west of where he'd fallen. There, behind the stump of an ancient tree, he uncovered the ragged canvas bag he'd stowed the day before. Dusty and worn, it had seen far better days, but it served its purpose. He pulled out a chunk of salted beef, slumped down against a weathered birch, and gnawing off a good-sized piece, began to chew. With a weary sigh, he closed his eyes, pressing his fingers against the lids, too tired to concern himself any longer with the whereabouts of one elusive Scot. "Must be out of my bloody mind." He bit off another piece of jerky, still muttering to himself. "Follow him, indeed. What was I playing at?" After taking another bite, he wiped his mouth. "Who do I blasted think I am, James Bond?" Maybe he should go home and forget about the whole excursion. After all, no one would ever believe him without proof, and the way things were going, his chances of that were slim. After a moment, he opened his eyes, blinking against the last last wisps of daylight. The sun sat low on the horizon, and a cool breeze whipped across the moor, causing the evening air to cut through the damp leather of his quilted jack. Instinct prompted him to pull his plaid close around his neck, and he rummaged through his bag for the piece of flint he'd thrown inside. He'd just managed to get a small fire going when a sharp blade slipped menacingly beneath his chin. "What clan be ye from, man?" the Scot asked with a coldness that rivaled the bog winds. He inched his way around until he stood before Edward, his sword shifting no more than a fraction as he did so. Edward froze, the auburn-haired Scot's expression brooking nothing less. Though not extremely large, the man was broad, with a strong arm and riveting gaze. Without a doubt, he knew his weapon well, and Edward flinched when the blade came to rest precariously above the blue scarf that covered his neck. "Speak now, afore ye canna speak at all," the Scot said, his words no more than a hiss. Edward didn't dare move. He hardly dared breathe for fear of causing the sharpened blade to cut into his bare flesh. The Fosters of Bewcastle. "Liar!" The word came out in a growl, the Scot's eyes narrowing to cat-like slits. "I ought cut your throat right here and now. Do ye think me a fool?" "No, of course not." Edward swallowed hard, knowing at any moment his head might be joining his boots. "All right, I'm not from Bewcastle, 'tis true." The steel edge pressed ever firmer beneath his chin, and sweat began to form on his brow. Without even taking another breath, he spat out the words. "But I am a Foster." "You're an outlander and nocht more. Perhaps old Walt would like this kin who's been claiming his name. Or better still, I'll bring him your head, so he can see for himself." "No, wait, I told you, you are right. I am an outlander, from Lancaster to be exact. I don't know how or when my family moved down there. They just did. Ask the Fosters if you like. Old Walt will tell you the same." Perhaps so, and that would explain your daft way of speaking and all." Robert sat down on the moss-covered stump, his head tilted to the side. "Or mayhap you're nocht more than a spy for your king." "I'd make a poor one then, wouldn't I?" Robert grunted a half-laugh. "Aye, you would that. All right then. Why have you be following me these last few days, Foster of Lancaster? Speak true, or die this night." Edward coughed to clear his throat, praying his trembling vocal cords wouldn't betray him. "I swore an oath to a lady, a beautiful one, and I mean to keep it." "And what has that oath to do with me?" "'Tis about a box," Edward said. "A jeweled box. May I show you, then?" Robert lowered his sword, using it to point toward the sack. "Aye, so long as 'tis no some weapon, for keep in mind ye would not even clear the sack afore your head hit the ground." "I wouldn't think of it." Edward forced a smile to his lips and pulled the small chest from the bag. "She said it belonged to an Armstrong lad up this way, and if I would swear to return it—" He bit his lip and lifted his shoulder in a shrug. "Well, she promised she would lay with me that night." "And did she then?" Robert asked with a roguish grin. Edward ducked his head, pretending the question embarrassed him. "Indeed she did, but when I woke she already gone, leaving me no indication as to his name. Now I'm bound by my pledge, but I have no knowledge of who the rightful owner is." Robert scratched his head. "Why'd ye no just keep it, man? Are ye afeard the lass will find ye out?" "I gave my word." Edward straightened up, his chin raised in indignation. "I thought a man's word meant something up here." "And what would an Englishman ken about honor?" Robert spoke through clenched teeth, his knuckles white as they gripped the hilt of his sword. "The likes of you did not even understand the concept. Ach, what more can I expect from an outlander? So tell me then, why do you reckon it belongs to me anyway?" "You're an Armstrong, are you not?" Edward asked, thinking his reasoning quite sound. "Aye, that's right enough, but there's many another on the border, so why come to me?" Edward leaned back against the birch and sighed, the proverbial albatross reappearing around his neck. He needed to think fast, not an easy task with the blade of a Scottish broadsword less than a foot away, ready to sever his jugular. "She mentioned he had deep auburn hair," he said at last, in a quick temper. Robert swung the tip of his sword back to its original position underneath Edward's chin. "What's that supposed to mean?" Edward stiffened, his gaze dropping to the polished metal. Nothing, only please take it so my oath is fulfilled. I just want to be done with it. No, so pleased with the lassie now, are we? Robert relaxed his blade once more, chuckling a bit before glancing over at the miniature chest. Well, being you've now way to ken who the rightful owner is, and seeing I am of the same clan, I guess there'd be no harm in me taking care of it for a while. My thoughts exactly. Edward shoved the intricate chest forward, his head pounding in anticipation. But wait, Robert turned his head, peering sideways from wary eyes. Where did ye say ye come by this lass? Where? Edward hesitated. How should he know? Except for the fact he bore the foster name, it was all just bollocks. And why did she no return it herself? Robert asked. Well, you see, Edward never planned on having to answer so many questions, and once again his throat tightened and his tongue seemed to have tied itself into a huge knot. The Scot, however, exhibited no patience for such obvious prevarication. Ah, I thought as much. You're a teller of tales, ye are. Once more Robert's grip tightened around the hilt of his sword, and his lips hardened into a thin line. Without another word, he drew the blade back up to Edward's neck, pressing the sharp tip into his skin and drawing a tiny trickle of blood. Carlisle! Edward said, his voice coming out in a croak. I met her in Carlisle! Robert pulled back, but didn't release his grip or return the sword to its scabbard. Go on, then. What were you doing in Carlisle? I had business there. He pulled down on his jack, feigning an air of indignation. To buy some wool for my father. Robert looked him over from head to foot, his gaze intensifying beneath lowered brows. Once more, Edward held his breath. He could feel his heart racing against his machine-sewn jack, certain the reproduction clothing he wore would never hold up to a close inspection, especially the faux leather boots he'd added at the last minute. Humph, Robert said at last. And she? How did she acquire such a broad chest? Edward hung his head, stifling a sigh of relief, but he wasn't in the clear yet. I don't know. Kill me if you must, but 'tis the truth. She stole it, I expect. Robert made a low guttural sound, then thrust his sword into the ground and leaned on its hilt. He rubbed his chin a moment before speaking, a smile threatening to break out on his ruddy face. And what was the wench's name, then, or did she slip away afore telling ye that as well? Name? Edward's mind raced in a desperate search for a viable answer, certain the future state of his anatomy might well hang upon his reply. 'Twas not her name that caught my interest. Robert burst out in a wholehearted laugh before leaning over and giving Edward a good-natured smack across the back. You're all right for an Englishman, but tell me, was she worth it? Yes, as a matter of fact, she was. Edward gave a tentative shrug to conceal any lack of conviction that may have crossed his face, and hoped for the best. The Scotsman reached down and picked up a piece of jerky, tearing a bit off before resting his hands on his knees. Well then, 'twas worth a wee bit of trouble, I reckon. Edward nodded, and a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. This was the chance he'd been waiting for. The Scotsman had at last let down his guard, if only for a minute. Seizing the moment, he thrust forth the jeweled case once more. His hands shook, but he doubted the Scot would ever notice, for he could see Robert's gaze fixed on the box that glistened in the firelight. The peculiar container captivated Robert, but he pondered his acceptance of such an extravagant object. Could it be a trap of some sort? Biting his lip, he surveyed its bejeweled exterior, reviewing the arguments for and against taking it into his possession until in the end he could no longer resist. Though still skeptical about its origins, he reached out to touch its glittering surface. In that brief instant, he knew he'd made a mistake. A variety of luminous-colored sparks began to fly from beneath its lid, but try as he might, he couldn't unhand it. What form of witchcraft be this? The air began to swirl around his heels, whipping hard against his body and causing his eyes to water as it swept around him in an invisible cocoon. Not witchcraft, Foster replied, a huge grin breaking out on his face. Pure science. A strong gust of wind nearly knocked Robert off his feet, and he had to duck his head against it. Still, he held firm to his sword, determined to fight whatever creatures he might encounter. Curse ye for casting this spell upon me. Robert strained his voice in an effort to make himself heard above the raging storm, but its roar had intensified to the point where his words simply echoed back in his own ears. Try as he might, he couldn't pry his left hand from the chest, and for a fleeting second he considered lopping it off with his sword. No, he would see this through like a man, whatever it be. Squaring his shoulders, he studied the scene before him. Never had he witnessed anything like it, even amidst the wildest squall. His stomach's clenched, forcing bile to rise in his throat, his hands so tight on his weapon the knuckles were devoid of any color, but he stood his ground nonetheless. The sandy-haired Englishman smiled, looking rather like the cat who swallowed the mouse, and not appearing at all bothered by the tempest swirling around them. Filled with fury, Robert fought once more to lift his sword, but the fierce winds beat hard against it, holding him fast. Then, all at once, a strange calm began to descend upon them, and a radiant glow burst forth from the surrounding area. Robert stood spellbound, the fragrant scent of Scottish bluebells and meadows sweet permeating his senses. A soft summer mist ruffled his hair, and for a moment he felt sure he'd found paradise. Could this be a messenger from God, come to take him to his just reward? A sudden wave of fear ran down his spine, but still he didn't waver. With a solemn reverence, he bent his knee before the Englishman, though he did wonder why the Lord would choose to send him an outlander for an angel. His heart pounded against his ribs, threatening to burst through the thick leather of his jack, but he wouldn't shame his clan. No matter where he found himself, he would face the situation with all the courage his father had instilled in him. First, however, he needed to determine where that place was. "Be ye angel or devil coming to claim me?" He took a deep breath, desperate to retain some semblance of composure, for his nerves hung by the thinnest of threads. "Me?" the Englishman said, his voice filled with amusement. "Neither, I'm afraid. My name is Edward Foster, and I've done no more than bring you 450 years into the future."